Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Justice News. I am your host, W.L. McAdoo, and tonight we will look into 3 different cases of police brutality and black and blue crimes that has terrorized our communities, our countries, and our local states. We will look into 3 main issues that has not, after 13 years, been resolved. February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin was shot and brutally killed while walking home by a neighborhood watch volunteer, George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman was found not guilty by the Florida State Stand Your Ground law. August 9, 2014, after 4 months of protesting for justice, Darrell Wilson, as of 9 o'clock the 24th on Tuesday, 2014, was found not guilty for shooting Michael Brown in the back 7 times. May 18, 2001 was hit hard by a family in a small community in North Carolina, where a mother found out that her son had been killed and brutally assaulted from a Guilford County sheriff officer and brutally beaten to death. Zimmerman was found not guilty because of the Stand Your Ground law in Florida. Stand Your Ground law protects a person who presumes to have held a reasonable fear of imminent peril of death or great bodily harm to himself or herself when in a threatening defensive force. Darrell Wilson shot Michael Brown 7 times because he felt a threat upon him while he sealed himself, unable to correctly get out of his vehicle while approaching Michael Brown and a friend coming from a store that was legally, apparently hours before, robbed. In a small community in North Carolina on May 18, 2001, a 22-year-old African male involved in a single vehicle accident and may have been assaulted based on limited information that was not proven in court. The victim was driving off the road and struck several trees and a wired fence. The speed was impacted at 65 miles per hour in a 35-mile zone, apparently a result to the accident. Clothes and hairs were tangled in the fence. Autopsy concluded that the victim, the first one said, that died of a gunshot wound to the chest. At the same point, the victim suffered blunt force injuries to his head, abrasions and conclusions on his forehead and ligature skull fracture, as well as abrasions, scratches, and contusions to his right and left legs, back of his right hand, and of the top of his head. The second autopsy report stated that blood and urine was negative. However, at his death, lab reports presented statues and substance of cocaine abuse. Teeth were knocked out, and 4 pieces of his teeth still attached to his gum line. There was 2 911 calls. Out of 8 of the witnesses, 2 of the witnesses stated that report of a naked man that was making a disturbance and waving his hands, asking for help and stating, "God is good." Families' awaits for justice are sometimes misunderstood the process of any investigation that goes on. Some families do not have that justice because the attorneys or prosecutors cannot build enough proof to clear the main statutes and laws that could change the results and the decisions of a juror. 4th Amendment and Wrongful Death Act, which is the last result. Let's look in the 4th Amendment and the Wrongful Death Act, that which is usually the last result, but is the hardest to prove. 4th Amendment. Unreasonable seizures bars police officers from using excessive force against a free citizen. Whether an officer has an excessive force is judged by a standard of object's reasonableness. We do not inquire into an officer's movements, intentions, or tendencies, and instead determine whether a reasonable officer in the same situation would have concluded that a threat exists justifying the particular use of force. Recognizing the police officers are often forced to make a split decision, judgment in situations that are tense, unclear, and rapidly evolving. We take care to consider the facts from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene and avoiding judging the officers from a 20/20 sight vision. However, if that doesn't get the justice for some families, usually some families go through the last resort, which is the Wrongful Death Act claims. In a Wrongful Death Act claim, has the right to use such force or may be reasonable necessary in the proper discard of his or her duties, but may not act maliciously in a wanton abuse of his or her authority or use of unnecessary and excessive force. Good evening and welcome to the conclusion of our Justice News. I am your host, W.L. McAdoo. I am hoping that you were able to understand why we look for justice for the loss of our loved ones and understand why, at most, it seems to be hard for the families to reach judgment and also have closure. Although with us trying to come together as a community and fight for protesting and communities come together seems like it's mostly to fight for the last word of the deceased. Although with our hate that starts in the beginning and our emotions that ends through the evening, sometimes that peaceful protesting that's where we start from come out to be a hatred towards a hateful war and discrimination against each other between the communities and the police. And if you look at the way it starts, we give the flame to the gasoline, which I know is what we start from, but that's usually where we end at. We try to create a peaceful situation, however, that threat that becomes from our ego and basically how we go forth is where the judgment seems to be harder for our families to get peace. Now, I want to give a special sympathy to the Michael Brown family and also the Trayvon Martin family, and most sincere sympathy to the family that's in the small community in North Carolina. And I hope we can come together and get through this horrible time that all of us are seeming to be together as one. I hope everyone will have a thankful and peaceful Thanksgiving. Some might be a little bit leaner than most, but we all need to come together as one, and hopefully this peace and this riot that's starting in Ferguson will come to an end. I am your host, W.L. McAdoo, and this is the conclusion of Justice News. You have a safe weekend.